They gave me the assignment on a Tuesday, which I remember because I was eating lunch and the sandwich was good, and I had been looking forward to finishing it. The courier came in while I had half of it left. He set the folder on the table beside my plate, waited, and I looked at him until he left, and then I read the folder while I finished the sandwich. The folder said there was a creature. It said the creature had appeared on the Grey-Hello Plateau 11 days prior, that 2 local survey teams had encountered it and withdrawn, that the second withdrawal had been somewhat faster than the first. It said the creature was of unknown origin and unknown classification. It said the unit I would be attached to, 3 younger intelligence operatives named Botha, Ferreira, and Smith, would carry containment equipment, tranquilizer rigs, and a full documentation kit. It said my role was consultant, which is what they call you when you are 63 years old and have spent most of your career in places nobody else wanted to go, and they want your experience but not your opinions. I finished the sandwich, I folded the folder, I went home and packed a bag. I want to be careful here about how I describe what I expected. I did not expect much. I had been in the field long enough to know that most things classified as unknown origin turn out to have a mundane explanation by the 3rd day, a misidentified atmospheric phenomenon, an animal from a range nobody had properly mapped, a piece of equipment that had drifted further than the logs showed. I had been attached to 4 such investigations in the past decade. All 4 had closed without incident. I packed accordingly. Light, warm, enough dried meat and hard biscuit for 2 weeks, a good coat. I did not pack anything to be afraid with, because I am old enough that I have largely run out of that particular resource, and I find I do not miss it. The drive to Grey-Hello takes 3 days from the city, 2 if you push, and both are pushed. He was the unit lead 34 compact, the kind of man who wore his rank in his jaw rather than on his collar. He drove in the front with Ferreira, who was quiet and methodical, and had the hands of a man who repaired things for a living. Lena Smith sat beside me in the back, reading documentation on a portable reader, occasionally making small notes on a pad. She was 29, I think, or close to it. She had the flat, analytical affect of someone trained to observe without reacting, which I respected. She did not try to make conversation with me for most of the first day, which I also respected. On the evening of the 2nd day, when Botha had pulled off the road to camp and Ferreira was making coffee on the field burner, she said to me, "How many of these have you done?" "Investigations like this one." "Yes." 4, I said, before today. "What was the outcome on each?" "All closed," I said, "nothing to report in the end." She nodded, wrote something on her pad. "What do you think this one will be?" I looked out at the flatlands. The Grey-Hello Plateau is a particular kind of desolate, not the dramatic, cliff-faced desolate that looks good in photographs, but the low, salt-bleached, horizontal kind that makes you feel as though the ground has simply given up on becoming anything. The sky was very large. The stars were excessive. "I think," I said, "that it will be what it is, and we'll find out when we get there." She looked at me for a moment as though this were either very wise or very unhelpful, and then she went back to her documentation. We reached the field station on the afternoon of the 3rd day. It was a half-collapsed prefabricated structure that had been set up by one of the earlier survey teams, and then abandoned when they withdrew 8 meters of plascrete wall on 3 sides, a roof that held over 2/3 of the interior, a pair of folding tables, and a generator that worked if you kicked it twice on the left side. Botha walked the perimeter with Ferreira and came back with a proprietary expression, the way men do when they are taking ownership of a place they have never been before. "Sensors at the 4 compass points," he said. "Trank rigs on the north and west, that's where the survey teams reported initial contact. Documentation kit set up inside. Smith, you're on monitoring. Steenkamp, you're on," he paused, which was the pause of a man trying to find a task for someone he doesn't entirely know what to do with, general support. "Fine," I said. I set down my bag and carried a crate of equipment to where Ferreira indicated. I did not tell Botha that in my experience, placing your tranquilizer rigs at predicted contact points before you have seen the animal move is almost always wrong, because he had not asked me, and because I had already decided that the three of them were competent at their jobs, and that my role here was to observe and to be available when they needed me, and not to be the old man who stood in corners telling people they were doing it wrong. We had 4 hours of light left. I used them to walk the ground. Not the perimeter, Botha had the perimeter covered. I walked the interior of the plateau in the directions the equipment wasn't pointing. I do this wherever I go. It is how I have spent 40 years of field work, walking ground that nobody is watching, looking at what is there. Not looking for anything specific. Looking at what the ground shows you when you are not asking it a question, when you are simply moving through it with enough patience to let it be itself. The salt flat hardpan was cracked in long parallel lines, like the surface of something very old that had dried slowly. There were shallow depressions at intervals, not quite bowls, more like the negative spaces a large body leaves when it rests. The edges of the depressions were smooth. Not worn smooth, the way stone is smoothed by water or wind. Smoothed by pressure, by weight applied many times in the same place, over what looked like a long time. I crouched beside one of the depressions and looked at it for a while. Then I walked back to the field station and ate my dinner and did not say anything about what I had seen, because it was not yet anything I could describe usefully. The creature came that night. It was close to the 3rd hour after dark, and I know this because I was awake. I have slept badly since my 50s, and I have made my peace with it, sitting outside the east wall of the field station on an equipment crate, eating a piece of dried meat and looking at the stars. The generator was running at low output inside. Ferreira was on watch behind the north sensor. Botha and Smith were asleep. I heard the sensors fail before I heard anything else. Not fail the way equipment fails when something breaks it. Fail the way a signal fails when the thing it is looking for is already inside the perimeter and moving in the direction the sensor is not pointing. Then I heard it move. It did not sound large. That was the first thing that surprised me in a mild way. 800 kilograms of armored carapace on salt flat ground should have sounded heavy. It did not. It sounded like wind moving through a gap in rock, a low, continuous, sibilant sound that was less a footfall and more a displacement, something shifting the air as it moved rather than striking the ground. Something that had learned, over however many millions of years its kind had been moving across this hardpan, that silence was not a trick, but a fact of anatomy. It did not try to be quiet. It was quiet. The way very large, very old things are quiet, not cautiously but constitutionally. I did not stand up. I turned my head in the direction of the sound and waited. The Vorak came around the east corner of the field station wall and stopped. I will try to describe it accurately because I have found in the years since that people's imaginations default to something either more monstrous or more familiar than the truth, and the truth is the only thing worth giving. It was roughly the size and weight of a large draft horse, but lo, it stood no more than 1.5 meters at the shoulder, built horizontally rather than vertically, like something designed by evolution to move under ledges and through tight spaces. Its carapace was amber brown where the light caught it and close to black in the plates between, layered in the way of bark or shale, each plate edged in a raised ridge that would have made running your hand along its back a poor decision. Its head was broad and low, set close to the body, and it had no eyes that I could identify in the way that I understand eyes. What it had were a series of lateral ridges along the forward skull that moved independently and caught the light in a way that suggested they were reading the space around it rather than merely looking. It had 8 limbs. The forward 4 were structured for movement, heavily plated at the shoulder and knee equivalent, with a terminal segment that spread flat against the ground when it walked and could, I would learn, apply approximately 400 kilograms of focused pressure. The rear four were more articulated, folded close to the body when it moved, capable of extension that it only showed me once and that I will describe when I come to it. It stopped 6 meters from me and was still. I looked at it. It, whatever its equivalent of looking was, moved those lateral ridges in my direction. We were still for perhaps a minute and a half. I finished my piece of dried meat. I did not do this as a performance of calm. I was calm. I was sitting on a crate in the dark on a salt flat 3 days from the city. An animal of unknown origin was 6 meters away, and I was 63 years old and genuinely tired of performing alarm on behalf of things that had not yet done anything alarming. Then it walked toward me. It covered the 6 meters in a low, fluid movement that I will say again did not sound like its weight. It stopped approximately 1 meter to my left, close enough that I could feel the radiant warmth from its carapace, which ran several degrees above ambient temperature, and it lowered the front of its body toward the ground. Not all the way. Enough. Then it was still again. I sat beside it for an hour before the shouting started. Ferreira came around the east corner with his torch and his tranquilizer rig and saw us and shouted, not words, just the first sound a man makes when what he sees does not match any category he has. The Vorak moved, not toward Ferreira, not away from him, but slightly in front of me, which is a detail I noted at the time and thought about for a long time afterward. Between me and the direction of the noise. Low, lateral ridges moving fast. Then Botha was there and Smith, and there were 3 people with equipment pointed at the Vorak, and the Vorak was entirely still except for those ridges, which had stopped moving and were oriented, all of them toward me. Steenkamp, Botha said, in the voice of a man who is controlling something with difficulty. Move away from it. Slowly. It came to me, I said. Move away from it. I stood up from the crate and took 2 steps to the side. The Vorak tracked me, not threateningly, just tracking, the way a large dog tracks the person it has decided it belongs with. Its body did not move. Its head turned with me. Botha and Ferreira held position. Smith, I noticed, had taken out her documentation kit and was recording. She was shaking slightly, but she was recording. After several minutes, during which nobody moved and the Vorak continued to simply be there, Botha said, "We'll reassess in the morning." The Vorak left before dawn. I watched it go, back around the east corner of the wall and out across the hardpan in that low, wind-through-rock movement until I couldn't hear it anymore. I went inside and slept 3 hours and woke up feeling the particular alert quality that I have learned, over decades, means something interesting is actually happening. Botha held a briefing at first light. He laid out what they knew, which was not much. The creature had breached the perimeter without triggering the sensors, had approached me directly and ignored the 3 of them, had not exhibited aggressive behavior, and had left voluntarily. He was precise and organized, and I could see him working very hard to keep the previous night inside a professional frame. The sensors, Ferreira said, didn't pick it up because of the carapace density. The mineral composition, I ran the residue from one of those ground depressions Steenkamp found yesterday. It's reading as something close to a naturally occurring electromagnetic dampener. We can recalibrate. Good, Botha said, do that. He looked at me. Steenkamp, you sat there for an hour. I did. Why didn't you move? I considered this. It didn't ask me to, I said. Botha looked at me with the expression of a man who has been given an answer that is technically accurate and entirely unhelpful. Ferreira made a note. Smith was watching me with the flat observational effect again, but there was something else in it now, a quality of attention that was less professional distance and more genuine trying to understand. The approach behavior, she said. The way it positioned itself. That's territorial signaling in most known species, marking you as within a defined radius of protection. Yes, I said, that's what it looked like to me too. You've seen that before. Not exactly, similar enough. Botha said, "We're not drawing conclusions yet." He stood up and the briefing was over and we got on with the day. It came back the second night. I was outside again, not by plan, simply because I sleep badly and the field station was close inside, and it came the same way, around the east corner, and it sat beside me. This time it came closer, perhaps half a meter, and I could feel the warmth of it against my left arm. Its lateral ridges moved for a while, reading whatever it reads in the air around a person, temperature, respiration, some chemistry I don't have words for, and then they went still. I had brought out a piece of dried meat. I held it out in my open palm, low and unhurried, the way you offer something to an animal you don't want to startle. The Vorak lowered its head. The terminal segment of its left forward limb, the flat, spread part, came forward and rested on my knee with approximately the pressure of a large man's hand. It took the meat from my palm with something at the forward edge of its head that I won't call a mouth exactly, but which served the function. It ate slowly, then it was still. I want to say something about what that stillness was like, because I think people imagine it as the stillness of waiting, of a thing coiled and holding itself in check, containing something that wants to move. It was not that. It was the stillness of a very old and very large thing that had nothing it needed to prove and no deadline it was working against. Every living thing I have been close to over 63 years carries some version of anxiety in its body, a low-frequency hum of threat assessment, of options being weighed, of the gap between where it is and where it would prefer to be. The Vorak sitting beside me on the second night had none of that. It was as settled as the hardpan it sat on, as settled as I was. We were two old, still things in the dark on a salt flat, and the night was going about its business around us, and neither of us needed anything from it. I thought sitting there about the question Smith had asked me, what it felt like. I had given her a workable answer. The more accurate answer was that it felt like the end of an argument I hadn't realized I'd been having, not with the creature, with the general weight of urgency that had followed me for 40 years of field work, the sense that somewhere nearby there was something I was supposed to be managing, containing, moving toward or away from. The Vorak had no interest in that argument. It had come to sit beside the part of me that wasn't having it, and in doing so it had made that part larger, more present. I am not a man who is given to this kind of thinking as a rule. I mention it only because I think it is relevant to what happened after. I sat with it for 2 hours that night. In the morning, Smith came to me while Botha and Ferreira were recalibrating the sensors, and she said, "Can I ask you something that isn't in the briefing framework?" "Yes." "When it sits with you, what does it feel like?" I thought about how to answer this. "Like talking to someone who's been in the field a long time," I said, comfortable with silence, not needing to prove anything. She wrote that down, then she said, "Does it frighten you?" "No." "Why not?" I looked out at the hardpan. "Because it hasn't done anything frightening. It's done the opposite." I paused. "It found the stillest thing on this plateau and it came to sit next to it. I don't think that's frightening. I think that's good judgment." She looked at me for a long time, then she wrote that down too. The tension in the team had a shape by the second day, and the shape was Botha. I want to be fair to him. He was running a containment mission, and the thing he was supposed to contain was spending its nights sitting beside one of his team members and eating out of his hand and ignoring the other 3 entirely. That is a professional problem, regardless of your personal feelings about it. The creature had not followed any of the documented behavioral patterns for animals of comparable mass and predatory structure. It had not tested the equipment, not approached the food stores, not done any of the things that a large, unknown predator was supposed to do when humans set up camp in its territory. It had simply come to me and sat down, twice, and Botha could not write a containment report around that. What I observed, and what I tried with limited success to put out of my mind, was a specific quality of frustration that I have seen before in capable men placed in situations that do not respond to capability. Botha was good at his work. He was organized and precise, and he had the physical composure that comes from having been genuinely frightened several times and having learned to metabolize it. He ran a clean mission. He kept Ferreira and Smith functioning at full capacity through what were, objectively, unusual circumstances. All of this was real, and I do not want to diminish it. What he could not do was stop wanting the creature to respond to him. Not aggressively. I do not think he was competitive with me in a personal way, or not primarily. I think he genuinely believed that his authority in this space should be legible to the creature. That if he stood correctly and held himself correctly and projected the right kind of confidence, the creature would recognize it the way a subordinate recognizes a senior officer's bearing. He had spent 15 years as a professional communicating authority through presence, and he expected the world to continue receiving that communication. The Vorak did not receive it. The Vorak walked past him every night as though he were part of the landscape, politely, without hostility, without any acknowledgement at all, and came to sit beside a retired consultant eating dried meat in the dark. I understood why that was difficult. Authority that cannot be received by anything outside the system that granted it is a strange and uncomfortable thing to hold. On the morning of the second day, before the Vorak came again, he had gone out to one of the resting depressions alone. I watched him from the field station doorway. He stood at the edge of it for a while, then crouched, then took out a piece of his own ration food and set it at the center of the depression. He waited for some time. Nothing came. He came back in, and his jaw was set in the way it's set when something did not go the way he had planned, and he did not mention it. I thought about saying something. I decided against it. There was nothing to say that would not sound like a lesson, and he had not asked for one. What I noticed and thought was significant, though I could not have told you then why, was that Ferreira handled it differently. Ferreira was not a man who organized his sense of himself around authority. He was a technician in the deepest sense, interested in what things did, not in what they were supposed to do. After the second night, when he was recalibrating the sensors and the Vorak's mineral composition residue kept throwing the readings, he spent 3 hours developing a workaround not because he'd been told to, but because the problem interested him. He was on his third attempt when the creature had walked past the sensor array without triggering it, and his first response had been to look irritated in the way of a man who wants to understand why something works before it stops working. He was afraid of the Vorak. I think any person with functioning survival instincts would have been, in proximity to that much armored mass, but the fear did not organize his thinking. It sat beside his thinking, the way the Vorak sat beside me. Smith I have already described. She was watching everything and writing it down and asking questions, and I respected all of it. The third night it brought something. I had not expected this. I was outside in my usual place, the crate against the east wall, and the Vorak came around the corner, and this time it was carrying something in the paired limbs at the front of its body, not the locomotion limbs, the ones that were folded underneath, that I had not seen it use before. It set the object down between us. It was roughly the size of a man's head, irregular, dark, with a surface that caught the lantern light in the way of polished stone but was not quite stone. It had the density of something very old. I looked at it for a while, and then I looked at the Vorak. Its lateral ridges were moving. I reached out and touched the object. It was warm. Not ambient warm, internally warm, the same temperature as the Vorak's carapace. It had a faint texture under my fingers like the reverse of braille, small raised points in patterns I could not read. I have thought about this moment more than any other moment on that plateau. Not because of what the object turned out to be. The analysts spent 2 years on it and could not determine whether it was a geological formation, a manufactured artifact, or something in a third category they did not have a name for. I have thought about it because of what it meant to receive it. You do not bring a thing to someone unless you understand, in some framework, the concept of giving. You do not select a thing from wherever you keep things and carry it across a salt flat and set it down at someone's feet unless you have a model of another mind. A model that includes the idea that the other mind might receive what you are offering and find it meaningful. I am not a scientist. I am not qualified to draw conclusions about the cognitive architecture of a creature that no analytical team has fully classified. But I have been alive for 63 years, and I have given and received things, and I know what the act looks like. I said very quietly, "Thank you." This is the part that I have been careful about in every report I have written and every conversation I have had since, because I am aware of how it sounds. The Vorex's lateral ridges stopped moving when I said that, all of them simultaneously, and then it lowered the front of its body to the ground, lower than it had before, flat against the salt flat hardpan, chin plate down, and held that position for approximately 30 seconds. Then it rose and sat again and was still. The lowering of the body. I have described this to 4 different behavioral scientists over the years and received 4 different interpretations, ranging from a dominance display unlikely, given the context, to a threat posture pre-charge, demonstrably wrong since it immediately resumed its settled position, to a form of mimicry possible, though what it was mimicking I could not say, to from the 4th scientist, who was older and more quietly honest than the others. I don't know. Something that mattered to it. I think it was the last one. I think something in the way I said it, the quietness of it, perhaps, or the absence of any quality of performance, registered in whatever framework the creature used to read the space around it. I think it recognized something in the 2 words that it was already looking for. I do not have the language to be more precise than that, and I would rather be imprecise and accurate than precise and wrong. I sat with it for 3 hours. I did not touch the object again. I left it where the creature had placed it, and I went inside before dawn, and I told no one about the object until the morning briefing. Smith's documentation instincts came alive in the briefing, in a way that was almost beautiful to watch. She wanted to collect the object, date it, run a mineral analysis, photograph it from 16 angles. Ferreira was already calculating how to transport it without contamination. Botha listened to all of it and then looked at me. "It brought you a gift," he said. "It left an object, yes." "Why?" "I don't know. I suspect it's communicating something, what I can't tell you." "And you said thank you to it." "I did." Botha was quiet for a moment. "That's not in the protocol," he said, which was the truest thing he had said since we arrived, and I respected him for saying it plainly. "No," I agreed, "it isn't." There was a long silence. Smith had stopped writing and was watching both of us. Ferreira was looking at his hands. "I want the rigs in firing position tonight," Botha said. "All 4 contact points. If the creature comes back and exhibits any behavior outside the established pattern, we fire." "The established pattern," I said, "is that it sits beside me." "Any behavior outside that," Botha said. I did not argue. I had no standing to argue. I said understood and went back to my general support work, which on that day consisted of checking the generator and inventorying the water supply and thinking, more than I usually allow myself to think in the field, about what was happening here. What I thought was this. The creature had selected me on the first night and had not changed that selection over 3 nights. It had not selected me because I was the most capable person on this plateau. Botha was the most capable by any professional measure. It had not selected me because I was the most interesting. Smith was the most interesting. It had not selected me for any quality that I could identify as a skill or an attribute. What I had, at 63 on a salt flat hardpan 3 days from the city, was a fundamental lack of urgency. I had no protocol I was trying to execute. I had no report I was trying to write. I had a crate and dried meat, and a sky full of stars, and nowhere I needed to be more than where I was. And the creature, whatever it was, whatever intelligence it carried in that broad low head and those amber black plates, had walked past 3 armed, purposeful, trained operatives, and had come to sit beside the one who was simply present. I think about that, I still think about it. The fourth night came cold and clear, and I was in my usual place, later than the previous nights because Botha had asked me to stay inside until he had checked all 4 rigs. I waited until he was satisfied, and then I went out to the east wall and sat on my crate and ate half a piece of dried meat and waited. The Vorak came around the east corner at the same time as the previous nights, within perhaps 20 minutes. It had whatever passed for its routine. It came to me and stood close, and I felt the warmth of it against my arm, and its lateral ridges moved in their slow reading motion, and I was calm and still and present in the way that I had been for 3 nights. I heard Botha move into position behind the north corner of the field station wall. I heard Ferreira on the west. They were quiet, they were good at their jobs, but after 40 years in the field I hear things that have been trained not to be heard. The Vorak's ridges shifted, not toward me, toward the north corner. I said very quietly, "Easy." Its ridges came back to me, it was still. For perhaps 40 minutes everything was still. The Vorak sitting beside me, its warmth against my arm, the object from the previous night still on the ground where it had placed it. The sky excessive with stars. The hardpan cracked and pale and horizontal and very old. Then Botha said from behind the north corner, "Ferreira, on my mark." I do not know what triggered it. Perhaps the creature had moved in a way the sensors read as a threat. Perhaps Botha had simply decided that 40 minutes of nothing happening was all the nothing he could sustain. Perhaps he was right and I was wrong, and the creature was waiting for something I could not see. I have thought about all of these possibilities over the years, and I genuinely do not know. What I know is what happened. Ferreira came around the west corner fast, already moving to the firing position, and the Vorak was off the ground before the rig was up. What I had thought were the 4 rear locomotion limbs were in full extension, and I understood then why the front 4 were built so heavily. They were anchors. They were meant to hold the body down when the rear 4 extended, and in full extension the rear limbs were each close to 3 meters of articulated force. It did not look like a lunge. It looked like a structure unfolding. Ferreira's tranquilizer rig was in 2 pieces on the salt flat. Ferreira was against the west wall of the field station, pinned there by one of the forward limbs at the shoulder, feet off the ground, with the particular very still quality of a man who has received a clear and physical instruction to remain exactly where he is. Botha came around the north corner with his sidearm up. The Vorak turned its head toward him. It did not release Ferreira. Its rear limbs reset to their folded position. It was very still. Botha held his position. He was breathing hard. His sidearm was up and his hands were steady, which told me what I had suspected, that he was genuinely good at this, that the steadiness was real and not performance. I stood up from the crate. "Put it down," I said. Botha looked at me. The expression on his face was one I have seen before in people who have reached the edge of their framework and are looking at what is on the other side of it. "Steenkamper." "Put it down," I said again. "It's not going to hurt him, it's making a point. When you've understood the point, it'll let him go." "And what is the point?" "The point," I said, "is that it was sitting quietly beside me and your man came around a corner with a weapon, and it responded proportionally to that." I paused. Think about what proportional means here. It could have done a great deal more than it did. Botha was very still for a moment. Then slowly he lowered the sidearm. The Vorak released Ferreira. It did not do it immediately. It held the position for another 3 or 4 seconds, the way you hold a position until you are certain the instruction has been received, and then it stepped back. Ferreira dropped from the wall and sat on the ground and did not move, which was the right decision. The Vorak came back to me. It came slowly, that low, fluid wind-through-rock movement, and it stood beside me and it was still. Botha stood at the north corner of the field station with his sidearm at his side, and he looked at me and the creature for a long time, and I could see him processing what had just happened, running it through every framework he had, finding none of them sufficient. "I don't know what to write in the report," he said finally. His voice was flat and precise and entirely honest, and I thought it was the best thing he had said on this whole trip. "Write what happened," I said. "The creature responded to a perceived threat with targeted, restrained force. It did not pursue, it did not kill, it returned to its point of orientation." "Its point of orientation," Botha repeated. He looked at me. "Me," I said. Ferreira was on his feet by then, moving his shoulder carefully to check whether anything was broken. His expression had passed through fear into something else, the quality of a man who has been picked up and put down by something that could have done significantly worse and knows it. He looked at the Vorak with the first unguarded respect I had seen from him, not the professional respect of a technician for a well-engineered system, something more personal than that. The respect you give to something that had a clean opportunity and chose not to use it. "It could have gone through the wall," he said, not to any of us in particular, just noting it, putting the fact on record. "Yes," I said. He looked at the two pieces of his tranquilizer rig on the salt flat. He looked at the wall where he had been pinned. He looked at the Vorak, sitting beside me with its lateral ridges in their slow, satisfied reading motion. "It chose not to," he said. "It chose not to," I agreed. Smith had been at the east wall the whole time, documentation kit running. She had not moved. She was still recording. Her face had the quality of concentrated blankness that I had come to recognize as her most intense state of attention. Everything turned inward to process, nothing available for expression. She would spend 3 days writing her section of the documentation report, and it would be, I later read, the most precise behavioral analysis filed for any non-cataloged creature in the unit's history. What she captured in those few minutes, the speed of the Vorak's response, the deliberate quality of the restraint, the immediate return to settled behavior, was documented with a precision that no committee could dismiss. "What do we do now?" Ferreira said. "We send a report in the morning," Botha said. He had found his professional voice again, the flat, organized voice, but it was slightly different now, less certain in its certainty, which is an improvement in anyone. Full account, behavioral documentation. Steenkamp writes his section separately. I nodded. I want to say something about Botha in that moment, because I think it is important. He had been wrong, his judgment call had been wrong. The sequence of events had demonstrated it as clearly as anything could, and 3 of the 4 people on the plateau were aware of that. In my experience, the way a person handles being wrong in the field is as informative as the quality of their judgment when they are right. I have seen men double down, which is dangerous. I have seen men collapse into apology, which is useless. I have seen men reframe the situation so that the wrongness becomes someone else's fault, which is corrosive. Botha did none of these things. He stood in the dark on the salt flat with the evidence of his error lying in 2 pieces on the ground, and he said the correct next thing clearly and calmly and got on with it. He did not apologize to me and he did not blame Ferreira. He simply proceeded. The quality that had made him a good operative was still present. It had been tested and it had held. I respected that. I still respect it. The Vorak stayed until close to dawn. It sat beside me and I sat beside it and nothing else happened, which was the whole point. When the sky began to go from black to the deep pre-dawn blue that means light is coming, it rose and moved in the direction of the rock shelf, low and fluid and very quiet. I watched it go. At the far edge of the lantern light it stopped and turned just its head, those lateral ridges oriented back toward the field station, toward me, and held that position for a long moment. Then it went over the shelf and was gone. I sat for a while after it left. I was not thinking about the report. I was not thinking about the protocol or the containment order or the object it had left me, which was still on the ground between where I had been sitting and where it had sat. I was thinking about the resting depressions in the hardpan, the ones with the smooth edges, the ones that had been made many times over what looked like a long time. And I was thinking about what the Vorek had found when it came to that crate on the first night. An old man with nowhere urgent to be, eating dried meat in the dark, entirely unbothered by the fact that he was on a plateau 3 days from the nearest other human being. I thought about what it had recognized in that. And I thought that it was, in its own way, exactly the same thing. We left the Greyhollow Plateau on the morning of the 6th day, 2 days after the incident with Ferreira. The Vorek had come on the 5th night and sat with me, and I had sat with it, and I want to describe that night because it was different from the others. It did not bring anything. It did not perform any behavior that I had not already seen. It simply came around the east corner and came to me and sat, and the lateral ridges moved in their slow reading motion for longer than usual, perhaps 20 minutes, and then they were still. And we sat for 3 hours as we had sat before. But the quality of the sitting was different, not worse, not less. Different in the way that the last conversation with someone you are about to leave differs from all the preceding conversations, not in its content but in its weight, in the fullness of its attention to itself. I do not know if the Vorek knew we were leaving in the morning. I do not know what its model of time looks like, or whether the concept of departure has a shape in its framework. What I know is that on the 5th night it was more present than it had been on any of the others, in a way I felt rather than observed. Warmer, perhaps, though the temperature of its carapace was probably the same. Closer to me, which was measurable, it was sitting with its shoulder plates touching my arm rather than a half-meter away. Its lateral ridges, when they finally went still, stayed still for longer than they had before. When the sky began to go from black to pre-dawn blue, it rose and moved in the direction of the rock shelf, low and fluid and very quiet. At the far edge of the lantern light it stopped and turned, just its head, those lateral ridges oriented back toward the field station, toward me, and held that position for a long moment. Then it went over the shelf and was gone. I sat for a while after it left. The sky went from blue to the pale gray that comes just before the first real light, and the hardpan was very still and very cold, and I thought about the resting depressions out there in the dark, the smooth-edged ones that had been made many times over what looked like a long time. I thought about who or what had sat in them before. I thought about what it meant that the creature had found me sufficient for this, for the thing it did in those depressions, whatever that thing was. Whether sufficient was even the right word, or whether it was something closer to recognizable, legible, the kind of thing it knew how to sit beside. I went inside and wrote the report. The report took me most of the morning. I wrote the factual account first, because that is what they would need: times, distances, behavioral descriptions, the object and its dimensions and temperature, the incident with Ferreira. I wrote it cleanly and specifically, and without interpretation, because that is what a good field report looks like. Then I wrote my assessment section, which I marked clearly as subjective, and which I expected would be given less weight than the factual account, as assessments from old consultants generally are. The assessment said this: the creature was not containable by the methods the unit had brought, not because the methods were inadequate for its physical specifications, they may or may not have been, but because containment was not the relevant frame. The creature had made its own determination about this team in the first 60 minutes of contact, and had organized its behavior around that determination consistently across 4 nights. The determination was not aggressive, not territorial in the conventional sense, not predatory. It had selected an orientation point and returned to it. What it was doing in those hours of stillness beside the orientation point was not a behavior I could classify, but it was clearly intentional and clearly valued. The object it had brought was not, in my view, a spontaneous action. It was a form of exchange, and what it had received in exchange for that exchange, I believed, was the thing I had given it on the first night. the willingness to sit still and be present with no agenda. The last line of my assessment said, "The creature has better judgment than any piece of equipment we brought with us, and our best posture going forward is to follow its lead." I expected Botha to remove that line. He did not. He read the full assessment, wrote his own report, and sent both upward together. His report was precise and complete, and contained one line in his own assessment section that surprised me. Consultant Steenkamp's field judgment has been the most operationally relevant variable in this investigation. He did not say it to me directly. I read it in the filed report and thought about it for a while. I thought it was generous, which is a thing I had not expected from him, and I thought it was accurate, which mattered more. He was not wrong about the judgment. He was wrong about what kind of judgment it was. It was not skill. It was the absence of something, the absence of urgency, the absence of the need to make the situation into something manageable, the willingness to let it be what it was. That is not something you can train a person to do in 3 days in the field. It is something you arrive at over a very long time, usually by failing at the alternative often enough that you stop reaching for it. I had arrived at it by accident mostly, and a creature on a salt flat had noticed. The object was carefully packaged by Smith and Ferreira and loaded with the rest of the equipment. I drove back in the rear seat and Lena Smith sat beside me, and for the first 2 days she did not say anything, and on the 3rd day, when the city was a day away, she said, "Do you think it'll go back to those depressions after we're gone?" "Yes," I said. "And wait." I looked at the road ahead, the long straight road out of the flatlands where the salt gave way to the first pale grass, and the horizon got complicated again. "I don't think it waits," I said. "I think it lives there, and occasionally something passes through that it finds worth sitting beside, and then it sits beside it, and when it leaves, it goes back to living there." She thought about this. "That sounds like a reasonable life," she said. "I've thought so," I said. She looked at me. She was going to ask something else. I could see her organizing it, and then she smiled a little instead, which was the most unguarded thing I had seen her do in 6 days, and she went back to her documentation. "The object is in a facility now. I have seen the analysis reports. The mineral composition is unlike anything in the index catalogs. The pattern of raised points on its surface is consistent across the whole object and appears to organize around a center that the analysts cannot identify as structurally determined. It is not a fracture pattern or a growth pattern or a cooling pattern. It is, as far as 6 different analytical teams have been able to determine, a deliberately arranged pattern. What it means, they cannot say. I have my own interpretation, which I have offered to exactly one person, Smith, in a letter several years after the mission, and which I do not pretend to be able to defend rigorously. The pattern on the object is organized around a center that the analysts cannot identify as structural. I think the center is not a physical feature. I think the center is an absence, a deliberate negative space, a place that the pattern orients around without filling in. And I think what it is gesturing toward, in the only language available to something that does not share a word with us, is the concept of presence without filling in. The concept of being there and not needing to occupy the center in order to matter. This is the interpretation of an old man who spent 6 days on a salt flat and has been thinking about it ever since. I put no more weight on it than that. I think about the Vorek on the 5th night, in the hours before dawn. I think about how its lateral ridges moved slowly over my arms and hands, that same reading motion, temperature, chemistry, the particular stillness of an old man who has run out of urgency, and how they went still when it was satisfied. I think about the 30 seconds it held itself flat against the hardpan, the night I said thank you, and what that meant in whatever framework it operates in. I do not have a name for what happened on the Grey Hello Plateau. Containment is obviously wrong. Contact is closer but still not quite right. What it feels like, when I sit with it after all these years, is something more like recognition. The creature crossed several kilometers of salt flat on the first night and walked past 3 armed, prepared, purposeful people and came to sit beside the one who was not performing anything, who was not trying to be anything, who was just there. I have had 40 years of field work. I have been in places that were cold and places that were very far away, and places where the only company for weeks was my own thinking. I have learned that the most dangerous thing you can bring into an unknown environment is the assumption that you already understand what you are about to encounter. And I have learned that the most useful thing, the thing that has brought me home more times than any piece of equipment I have ever carried, is the willingness to be still, to be present, to let the environment come to its own conclusions about you before you go rushing to conclusions about it. The Vorak came to conclusions about me in about 60 minutes. I have been thinking about its conclusions for 11 years. The mission was closed as non-recoverable for containment purposes. The creature was reclassified from unknown predator to, and this is the language the committee settled on after considerable discussion, non-hostile autonomous intelligence of undetermined social structure, pending further observation. The further observation has not happened, to my knowledge, because the Grey-Hello Plateau is remote and the logistics are difficult, and there are always things with higher priority. Botha runs a training division now. I hear he is good at it. Ferreira, I am told, still moves his right shoulder carefully in cold weather, which is a story he tells at debriefings, and which I think he has come to regard with something like pride. Smith sent me a note 2 years after the plateau. It said, "The analysts found a second object, same mineral composition, found on the plateau in one of the resting depressions 2 months after we left. The pattern on it is different, longer, more organized, arranged around the same undetermined center." She had attached a photograph. I looked at the photograph for a long time. I have not been back to the Grey-Hello Plateau. I have thought about it. I am 66 now and my knees are worse, and the drive is 3 days and nothing about it makes practical sense. But I still sleep badly. And on the nights when I am awake at the 3rd hour after dark, I sometimes sit outside and eat a piece of dried meat and look at the stars, and I am very still, and I am simply present, and I think about what it is that a creature of 800 kilograms and 40 million years of evolutionary development, carrying something in its broad, low head that 6 analytical teams cannot classify, decided was worth sitting beside. And I think that there is no report that will ever fully contain what that is, and I think that is fine. I think that is the whole point. Some things do not want to be contained. Some things want to be sat beside, in the dark, on a salt-flat hardpan that has been cracked and pale and horizontal for longer than we have been anything at all. And the only way to know that, the only way to earn the right to sit beside them, is to arrive with nothing to prove and nowhere urgent to be. I knew that at 30. I forgot most of it by 40. I have spent the last 23 years remembering it again. The Vorak remembered it the first time it met me and never needed to learn it twice, which I think makes it considerably wiser than I am. This does not bother me. I have been considerably wiser than by things I respected. It is good company to keep. I have told this story in debriefs and to colleagues, and once to a committee that wanted to know if we should go back. I tell it the same way every time. I do not dress it up. I do not make it more dramatic than it was. It was an old man on a crate in the dark, and a creature the size of a draft horse coming to sit beside him and the world being, for a few hours on 4 consecutive nights, very quiet and very large and entirely sufficient. The committee did not go back. I understood their reasons. I thought they were wrong, but I understood them. If I were asked, I would go back tomorrow. I would bring dried meat and a good coat and nothing else, and I would sit on the east side of whatever was still standing out there, and I would wait, and I would not be surprised at all if, sometime in the 3rd hour after dark, I heard that low sound wind through rock, displacement rather than footfall, coming around the corner. And I would sit still, and it would come and sit beside me. And that, I think, would be exactly enough.